Hello my friends and welcome back to Coffee Tea Paper. So we're continuing with our collage tutorial today. So here are the supplies that I listed in my other video where I walked you through the various collages for the Bookbinders Design Invitational Collage competition. Pause, take a screenshot. I'll also be putting the information in the description box below, but if you are interested in making this style of collage, I'm here today to give you some recommendations and processes for how I made them myself. I have another collage tutorial video which is more based in a journal style, and it's designed to be a flat lay, similar to this Christmas card that I created last year. I tend to overlay different elements, but a lot of the theory behind it is the same. Having a background paper that's not blank but not too busy, having anchoring elements, having some interesting smaller decorative pieces, coming in with some washi tape and stickers, and adding some other interesting things too, like a wax seal, for example. You could also distress the edges for something like a journal page or a Christmas card or a postcard in order to give a more interesting textured look. For these standalone collages in this technique that we're looking at today, I'm using these very natural papers with lots of inclusions in to give that interesting detail in the background, but that's not going to compete too much, and just tearing the edges so it's got a very soft feel. So here I'm just identifying the main area of that piece of paper that I want to feature in my collage, and taking my first tear along the top there and lining it up on my base piece of cardboard in order to get the dimensions of the ripping, essentially. I'm not going to show you every excruciating detail of the ripping. I'm sure you know how to rip paper. You could also use a Decorative ruler, for example, or some decorative scissors if you didn't want such a organic-y torn edge look. For gluing down this main piece, I like to use this Kokuyu glue. This is the large style, and having the blue glue in the Kokuyu glue I dare you to say that 10 times quickly, successfully. It goes on blue, and as it dries it goes clear, but it allows you to see that you have covered the full piece of background cardstock before gently laying down your piece of background paper. The other thing I like about this glue stick is it's a little forgiving, so I would just want to slightly adjust my placement there, and it allowed me to lift it up and peel it off while it's still in a semi-tacky state. Once you're happy with it, it's then also very easy to smooth down with no bubbles or wrinkling or anything. It's just a really high quality glue stick. I recently bought a pack of 5 small ones on Amazon. I think it was 5 for $25, free delivery. In order to give you an idea, I am creating another nature-based collage because it was definitely one of my favorites, and of course you all know by now that I do love birds, and one of my lovely pen pals, Jane, who has a YouTube channel, JP Pen and Ink, sent me this bird sticker that she made herself from a vintage illustration in a bird book. So that is going to be my headline piece, my signature piece, my star of the show. You don't have to use one, you can use a couple like I did in the other collage with the 2 birds facing each other, but for this one I'm just going to use this one bird. So there is a lot of faffing around, but I wanted to keep most of that in this video just to show you that I don't make instant decisions about where I'm going to place things. I do finesse and move and replace and generally faff around, for want of a better word, in order just to get the relationships of the elements to each other correct and, well, correct, aesthetically pleasing, shall we say. So I just think about how the elements relate to each other, how they relate to the page, how they relate to the background, decorative items, and I am a bit biased towards leaning towards a upper left hand corner to bottom right hand corner sort of emphasis, if you like, because that's how we read. We read from top left, we go across to the right, and we finish at the bottom right hand side of the page. And I just think that's a very natural eye movement for us. So I tend to think that collages that follow that same pattern tend to just work nicely with that sort of layout. So I'm just showing you here with much faffing. Feel free to fast forward how I want the different pieces to relate to each other. So those two labels I've used in the background, you could easily use pieces of paper that you've torn out, tickets, oh look, memo notes, anything that's not too busy and that just fades into the background, doesn't compete, but also just creates a bit of that middle ground, helping to create that middle ground in your picture. So these ones I am trying to create a little bit of a three-dimensional effect, which is it's not great to put in your journals. It does make them very chunky, but for a standalone piece like a special card or an art piece, it's really interesting and it's fun to do. It's something a bit different. You could easily have a frame stamp out something here. If that's what you have, you could tear a thin frame, you could draw one in. You don't necessarily even need one. These perforated frames are quite useful because you get a number of items on each page. They're just an AliExpress sort of staple. They probably have them on Temu as well. They're relatively inexpensive, but they're quite an excellent thing to have on hand if you are interested in making collages. I'm just using my origami bin here to tidy up my desk somewhat. The only thing I don't like about them is that they have the little lumps from the perforations, and so my preference is just to smooth them off. I just do that with the scissors. The other thing I like to do is have some very straight edges and then some torn edges, just to create a bit of visual interest and point of difference between sort of background, middle ground type elements that I'm putting on the page. I've used one label there which is vellum, so you can see through it, and one that's paper, which makes it opaque, and that gives a sense of depth as well. By using a frame, or you could use a window die cut, or you could cut your own, that gives a sense of perspective as well, because when we look through frames or windows, we're expecting something beyond. Like we know that there's something, like we're here, then there's something in between, and then something beyond. Now, normally I would take a photo when I have finished faffing around and I'm happy with all my placement of pieces, but because I'm using my phone to film, I have just carefully slid it across. For the vellum, I used the quickie glue. It's really good on vellum. It doesn't cause it to wrinkle or buckle. And for the other paper pieces, I'm just sticking with the Kokuyu glue stick. So of course, this is just a guide. You don't have to follow this. But if you're new to collaging or new to this style of collaging, It's certainly helpful to have a few tips and ideas of where to start. There's some really good resources around. Of course, you can use images from magazines, from brochures. There's actually a lot of collage books that are now available which have images on one side and blank or pattern paper on the other that you can cut out to use. Sometimes they're in a theme, sometimes they're in like come from a period of time. For example, Victorian imagery or coffee house or plant lover, botanist's dream, any one of those things. I have one book that I enjoy which is quite useful. It's called Extraordinary Things to Cut Out and Collage by Maria Riven. So saying that, none of these images are actually from that book. There's some smaller ones, some medium-sized ones, and quite a lot of large ones that for the size that I like to work in is a little bit tricky. There's certainly a mass of variety. Of course, if you go to old book sales or old book like secondhand bookstores, often they have ones that aren't in such great condition but might have really nice illustrations in them but wouldn't be perhaps suitable for someone to read, or they might have pages that have been torn or scribbled on. Instead of just letting them be thrown out, they're actually quite a good source to cut up and reuse and create something beautiful with something that was destined for the tip, essentially. So that's always a good idea to go and check out your local charity store, or we have one here in Brisbane, and it's they call it, oh gosh, I can't remember, like the dump store or something. It's things that have been salvaged from the tip. So yeah, something to keep in mind. Also, a lot of free images online that you can print and cut out. If you don't have a printer, often you can get things printed at office stores or local libraries for a small fee, which might work out to be a really cost-effective way to get a variety of images as well. Now, I've just brought in here in the left-hand side a sheet of foam, like teeny tiny little foam squares, and that's how I've been adding that next layer of dimension to the images that are going to create the foreground of this picture. So we've talked about the background using a paper with some sort of pattern, so it's not quite as intimidating as a blank piece of paper, but not so busy that it's going to compete with your other images. And then putting down some fairly plain anchoring pieces to create that next level, and then coming in with your middle and foreground images, and then of course your hero image. Now, Jane sent this bird to me, as I mentioned, and it's a sticker, but because I want to raise it up off the page and put those foam squares behind it, I've actually put it onto some more sturdy cardstock first, and now I'm going to fussy cut that out just to create a more solid base to stick the foam squares to and get the birdie raised from the background. So yeah, you can just see I'm just sort of giving it a flick there to indicate it's thicker and more sturdy. Now this bird happens to be sitting on a branch as part of the image, so I'm trying to make sure when I line up the plant elements in this picture that the branch goes in line with one of the images, and so it's not coming off at a funny angle, and it might somewhat be disguised, so it looks like he's sitting on a branch that's coming out from one of the plants, for example, just looking for small details like that can really enhance the naturalness, symmetry. Yeah, I think it just makes the layout work a bit better. Like, even though you're sticking in random stuff like labels and stamps and things, having the natural pieces working well together creates that illusion, I think, as well. Like, he could be sitting on a branch in a garden bed in front of somebody's window, for example. That's the sort of thing that we're looking at. Of course, you don't have to keep adding things. You can make a collage with probably a minimum of 3 things if you really think about it: a background, a middle ground, and a foreground, and that would probably be enough for many people if they're wanting to do something really minimalist. But I do like to add in some extra things. So for this particular image, one of my small decorative elements is going to be that stamp of another kingfisher bird, but I want to frame that as well. Now, the keen-eyed among you might notice that I've actually bent the top of that flower slightly pointing to the left. That's because I didn't want the flowers to overlap, but I wanted them to nestle around the bird. Now I am just trying to work out what I want to do with the stamp, and in the end I decided, rather than having it overhang the frame here, the miniature frame, I want it to sit in the middle and literally frame the stamp. I am also going to put the stamp on a piece of sturdier cardstock and elevate that off the page also, just to add a bit more of that 3-dimensional look to the page. The other thing I like about this stamp is that it is also a kingfisher bird, and the birds are facing each other. So looking for small details really can lend a sense of deliberateness. I can't think of another word. A feeling of each element was chosen deliberately for its relationship to the others on the page. Of course, you don't have to. You can just use this process as a form of art therapy to enjoy cutting, sticking, gluing, placing, picking colours that appeal to you. If the purpose is the creative part, or if the purpose is the end result, sometimes they can lend themselves to different styles. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So I am now trying the very difficult decision-making process of choosing which washi tape I want to use. I often tend to come back to the same washi tapes. I particularly like using grids or plain ones on collages because I don't want them necessarily competing with what's already there, but rather lending themselves as additional points of interest that you don't really notice unless you start really looking at the page. It's a little bit tricky sometimes. I decide I would like to have some washi tape over things, under things, and maybe a pair of tweezers would be good at this point. But if you only just sort of lightly stick down parts of your collage as well and don't glue right to the edges, that also lends you some flexibility later when you can come and just gently lift those edges to perhaps just slide things underneath, whether it's an extra piece of paper, an extra piece of imagery, or something like washi tape or a washi dot sticker, for example. I often end up tearing the washi tape, sometimes on one side, sometimes on both sides. And I think having the rougher edges allows it to blend more with the paper behind rather than creating a sharp contrasting line. This particular grid washi tape here of this sort of sagey olivey green is one of my all-time favourites, particularly when doing collages that feature leaves, because it's a very natural looking green, and I'm going to be very upset when I use it, but I love using it. I got this one from Note and Wish, which is a designing sister duo in the UK. I'm being very pedantic here and putting a piece under that frame to try and give the frame some really interesting ins and outs. Now, one of the other things I like to add to my collages is some stamping. You can stamp over things, and it's another good way to tie different elements together by putting a stamp very lightly over the top. Just working out here what colours I think go best. As always, I tend to go more with the natural colours, the greens and light browns and so forth. Now, I don't want these stamped images to start competing too much with the natural inclusions on the paper, so I'm stamping them off before stamping them on the paper, and it actually makes it rather difficult to see on the video, but they are there, but they're meant to be very, very subtle, and so subtle that you can barely see them. They're easier to see in real life. I'm also just using that scrap bit of paper to mask off areas of the collage that I don't want ink on, mostly because I'm afraid it might not dry so well and smudge, but you don't have to do that. Anyway, I hope you found this little walkthrough of my collaging process helpful or inspiring, or perhaps just relaxing. It's a very fun and enjoyable process that anyone can do. This one, I really, really like the colours in here. The blues, the greens, they just work really nicely together. And sometimes that's half the battle. It's maybe not so much about placement, but maybe how the different elements relate. Thank you so much for watching, and please hit that like button, and if you're not a subscriber, think about subscribing, and I will see you here next time. Bye for now.